Thank you for joining us for this week's Oregon Wild Wednesday webcast, our presentation about some of the plants and animals found here in the Pacific Northwest, where we call home. My name is Chandra Legui. I've worked for Oregon Wild for nearly 20 years, based in our Eugene office, and I will be your guide through this webcast this evening. Before we begin, I just want to offer a few housekeeping items. First, many of you bought raffle tickets, and we appreciate your support. The raffle helps us not only put on presentations like this, but funds our important conservation work. This week, the raffle is an opportunity to get one of our presenters' books, as well as one of mine. You can still get raffle tickets through this evening, where you signed up for the webcast, and we'll do the drawing tomorrow and let the winners know. A video of this webcast will be emailed out tomorrow for those who registered, and we will be posting it on our website, OregonWild.org, under Wild Blog. It can also be found on our YouTube channel, so feel free to share. We would love that. And stay tuned for upcoming webcasts this spring. There's nothing that's on our website yet for sign up, but we have a couple of exciting ones coming up, from canoe culture of coastal tribes to Oregon's amphibians and stories of wandering wolves. So stay tuned. And before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this land that we now call Oregon, not just the forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts that those of us at Oregon Wild celebrate and work to conserve, but the places of art and industry, science, and community that are built upon those lands. A number of indigenous peoples and federally recognized tribes call the areas that we'll be talking about today home, and many of those people were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands and from the traditional roles they played in these landscapes. So we offer our respect to these indigenous peoples who were here before us and are here today. All right, now on to tonight's topic. I am pleased to welcome Josephine Woolington, a writer, musician, and educator who has just published her first book, Where We Call Home: The Lands, Seas, and Skies of the Pacific Northwest, which she will share with us tonight. After Josephine's presentation, I will spend a few minutes talking about Oregon Wild's work, and we'll save some time for Q&A at the end. You can enter your questions at any time using the Q&A bubble in your user interface, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Josephine.
All right, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I feel like I've watched so many of these webinars that you host, and I've found amazing authors, local authors through them. So I really appreciate being a part of this and what you offer the community. So I am going to share my screen. There we go. All right. So this is the cover of the book, and it's a natural and cultural history essay collection about 10 native plants and animals in the Pacific Northwest. I was lucky enough to work with a local artist and also an author in his own right, and chef and food sovereignty activist Ramon Shiloh, and he designed the beautiful cover. So he also designed inside illustrations for each essay. And these are some of my favorites. So I guess before I jump in, just a little bit about me. I am, as Chandra said, a writer and a musician. I worked at several newspapers in Oregon before freelancing. And so I approached this work journalistically. I interviewed about 60 local experts, scientists, historians, tribal leaders, artists, and used their knowledge and kind of my experience combined to tell the stories of the 10 species that I focus on. So I'm born and raised in Portland. I'm actually a 4th generation Oregonian, so this place means a lot to me. And this photo is not the best. I know airplane photos never are, but This moment just struck me. This was last summer, and I just wanted to kind of start with it to kind of share where my thoughts and thinking has been lately around home and landscapes. And so this is coming into PDX from the east, and actually I'll use my cursor. Hopefully you can see that's downtown Portland. And then these are the Tualatin Mountains. And I was just really amazed to see this view. And then behind them, the Coast Range. And then you can see all the buttes, Mount Tabor, Mount Scott, Rocky Butte. And so I've been, just as I was doing my research and even before, just thinking more on a landscape level. Like, I am from Portland, but where am I from kind of in the ecosystem? I'm from the Willamette Valley. I grew up close to the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia, the watershed of the Northwest, and just visualizing where I am in this place, where I am relative to the mountains and the rivers, has just really kind of guided my curiosity and my work lately. And so I wanted to start with a few quotes that I've also gone back to throughout my research and through the last few years that just stick with me. The first one is from an Nisqually leader and activist, Billy Frank Jr. And he said, "I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the floods, the owls, the hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking. They're measurements. They tell us how healthy things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same." And then another quote that I've gone back to is from a Dakota historian named David Larson. And this was featured in an Emergence magazine article, I believe, 2 years ago. And he said, "When you know what was taken away, then you can reclaim it." And so here's an image of a camas patch, a prairie remnant Acamassia natural area, if anyone has been there. It's on the westland side of the Willamette River. So we're looking right across at Oregon City and really close to Willamette Falls. And so I was just struck by these remnants of landscapes that would have covered the whole Willamette Valley. And kind of before this project, before the pandemic, I really didn't give much thought to what type of landscape would have been where Portland was. And so I'll just read a bit from my introduction just to give you all a little bit more of a sense of the book and my inspiration. "I'm from the Willamette Valley, where my home was once a lake bottom after a 2,000-foot tall ice dam hundreds of miles away collapsed and inconceivable amounts of water flooded the ground I now walk on. I grew up near the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers, where snowmelt and rainwater from all over the region joined to complete their journey back to the ocean. Not far from my childhood home, grizzly bears once indulged in Oregon white oak acorns, condors showed off their wingspans, and long ago bison roamed. Until a few years ago, I didn't pay much attention to what kinds of birds visited my backyard or what types of trees lined my neighborhood streets. I didn't think much about how Portland's Tualatin Mountains had formed from ancient basalt flows that now give the rich the best views in the city. I didn't know how long East, who we now call Mount Hood, has watched over the valley. I didn't know the names of the many native tribes and bands like the Kalapuians of what we call the Willamette Valley, who were forced to give up their land and culture for people like my great-grandparents. I knew next to nothing about their relationships to native plants and animals. As I got outside more and befriended wildflowers, trees, glaciers, birds, and rocks, I realized how little thought I had given to the processes that create our landscapes. I never wondered where native species came from, how long they've been here, or what makes them unique. I didn't hike until after I graduated college and never owned a pair of Keens or any earth-toned clothing until a few years later. And I always add a little caveat that I still don't own that much earth-toned clothing. I've always known, though, from visiting the Oregon coast and Columbia River Gorge as a kid with my family, that waterfalls and big trees within 30 minutes of my home are the kind of friends who give good hugs and listen deeply. Clouds and saltwater remind me of something bigger than our day-to-day. In the last several years, my journalistic curiosity prompted many questions and inspired me to deepen my shallow understanding of home. I wanted to learn about native plants and animals to connect with something real, especially when so much of our digital world distorts concepts of time and place. I started to notice how trees and logged forests grow at the same height. I recognized invasive plants where native plants should grow. I reflected more on how our way of life and desire for progress, all of which I participate in, require the perpetual destruction of landscapes, even in our supposed liberal green Pacific Northwest. In an age of distraction, personal brands, and constant market growth, I started to realize that maybe it's somewhat radical to be rooted in a place and entertained by things that can't be commodified. The idea for this book came to me in 2020 when I couldn't hug my parents for over a year and the world felt close to its end. While hazardous wildfire smoke required an N95 mask to simply take out the trash, I read natural history books about local geology, birds, mountains, and people. I felt comfort in looking far back to climate changes of the past, to species evolution, and it helped me in some ways to wrap my mind around our own impermanence. In writing this, I hoped that maybe I could try to better understand our climate crisis, relationships we have with the natural world, and where people have historically fit into ecosystems. So that's just a bit of the introduction. And kind of going back to the second quote I shared about you need to know what was first taken away before you can reclaim it. I felt that, to honestly tell the natural histories of these species, we have to talk about the removals of the first people from their lands and how that is directly tied to the destruction of these landscapes. So it's organized in the seasons. So I start with spring with camas blooms in the Willamette Valley. And so here's an image of camas. Probably most of you know what they look like. And they're going to start blooming here maybe in a month, a little bit more than a month. I think this was probably taken in mid-May. And this was from an area in Mount Pisgah. I'm getting my camas photos confused. And so Mount Pisgah is featured in my essay. It's one of the largest publicly owned prairie remnants in the Willamette Valley. And there's not much of them left. Most of all the prairies have been plowed and converted into homes and agriculture. And so in this essay, I tell about the Calapooians' relationship with this plant, which has an edible bulb, and how they maintained the prairies. So if it wasn't for their annual burns, the Willamette Valley would have been overcrowded with Doug firs. So their annual burns kept the prairies open and rejuvenated the camas every year so that they had more of it. And they would only harvest the big bulbs and they left the small ones and scattered them close to the surface. And so as I mentioned, kind of like detailing the destruction of landscapes in the last 200 years, I really found, learning about people's relationships with the landscapes, the old ancient relationships, the reciprocal relationships, gave me a lot of hope and kind of allowed me to rethink humans' place in ecosystems, and that it's not always a destructive type of relationship, or it doesn't have to be. And this is another image from Mount Pisgah. You can see the white oaks here, some camas blooms in the foreground. In the next essay, I apologize for the poor quality, but I like to make sure that I show the individuals who I saw during my reporting. And it was also kind of fun because I ended up writing the whole book in the order of the seasons, because as when I got my book deal, I was like, okay, it's May, I have to go see the camas in bloom now. And then, oh, it's spring migration, the sandhill cranes are in Malheur. And so it all just kind of worked out naturally, which was really fun. And so these are two cranes who I saw in Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Actually, this one nesting was just outside the refuge in southeastern Oregon in Harney County. And the greater sandhill cranes, they nest in Malheur, and the lessers use Malheur as a stopover site to continue on to their breeding sites in British Columbia and farther north into Alaska. So here's an image from the refuge. If you've ever been there, you can see in the distance, that's Steens Mountain. It's a large fault block mountain. That's kind of unassuming if you've never been there. It's almost 10,000 feet, or just about there. I might be wrong on that. And then there's a lot of wetlands within this area. Of course, not as much as there used to be, which is part of the story of sandhill cranes, that, you know, wetlands are more and more getting developed, especially in the Central Valley in California, where they spend their winters. And it's estimated, I think, by maybe 2050 that they could be pushed out of their US breeding and wintering sites. In the chapter 2, I detail fun just biology of these amazing creatures. Here's a pair doing one of their elaborate dances and courtship. Sandhill cranes mate for life. And I should say they're Oregon's tallest bird. They're huge. They're really loud. They have extremely long tracheas that spiral in their chest, which is why their voice is so booming. And not many birds have that. Trumpeter swans have that, and that's kind of why they project so well. And I stole this photo from Malheur Friends. They posted it on their Instagram today, and I just thought it was so lovely. And kind of a funny story with my research on sandhill cranes is I thought that I had to go to Malheur, 5 hours away from Portland to see them. And I wasn't aware that a different population of sandhill cranes actually winters basically in Portland. So this is an image from Frenchman's Bar, just west of Vancouver on the Columbia. And if you're a birder, they're at Sauvie Island all the time. This time of year, there's about 2,000 of these cranes that winter here, and then they breed in British Columbia. And so that just kind of reminds me of how disconnected we can be from these natural migrations that are happening all around us. I had no idea that there were, 10,000 snow geese that came and wintered here in cranes. And the next essay is yellow cedar. So I chose yellow cedar just as I think most people are familiar with red cedar. So I was reading in a tree identification book that I have about the other type of cedar in the Cascades and Olympics called yellow cedar. So I was just intrigued to learn more about this other type of cedar that I had never heard of. And these two images are from Echo Basin, and this is just near Santiam Pass. And it's a really cool spot, a short hike. The tree on the left is known as Big Mama because she's huge. You can kind of get a sense. If I was in this photo, I would be very tiny, just right down here. And a Forest Service researcher who I interviewed, they're not sure how old she is, but yellow cedar is very slow growing because it typically likes higher elevations, right around 4,000, 5,000 feet. And so Big Mama could be, she's at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 years old. And these trees are also old growth, even though they might not look as large as red cedar can get, but just since yellow cedar grows in these higher elevations, they're just slower growers. And the first place that I went to see yellow cedars was actually in Eastern Oregon. Their range is, they're most commonly found in Alaska and British Columbia. They're also known as Alaska yellow cedar. So up there, because it's so cold and wet, they grow at sea level. But their southern part of their range is kind of in the Central Cascades. But there's this little relic population east of the Cascades in the Aldrich Mountains, which is a part of the Blue Mountains. And this grove is called the Cedar Grove Botanical Area. And it's kind of near John Day, near the Malheur National Forest. And these cedars have been growing, and scientists think the most likely explanation is that they're a relic of the Pleistocene, when this area was kind of more like Alaska. And so I went and visited, and as you can see, though, they're a bit scorched. A 2006 wildfire was burning in the mountains surrounding the grove, and the Forest Service set a low intensity burn to ideally save the trees, but it ended up killing 90% of them. So there was a reseeding effort, and they're starting to come back, but there definitely are still cedars up there. So it's a really unique pocket of Eastern Oregon. And just to give you a bit more perspective, these like Alaskan coastal trees are growing, within half a mile of Ponderosa. So it's a unique spot if you haven't been there. Also part of the Yellow Cedar chapter, I feature a Haida artist who comes from a long line of Haida weavers and artists, painters, and Ariane Medley is her name. This is just an example of what a traditional Haida basket looks like. It's really small with a cute little lid. And this is actually spruce root. So pretty amazing to think of spruce roots transforming into this beautiful piece. And then here's a hat, I believe also a spruce root hat, woven by her great-great-grandmother. And then the frog painting is by her great-great-grandfather, Charles Edenshaw. And that shows the northern formline style of Haida and Tlingit. And she also, she weaves chilcat blankets. You've probably seen one of these. This image is from the Burke Museum in Seattle. And it's the work it takes to make this blanket is the equivalent of making a totem or a canoe. It takes, months and months, even just the processing of cedar bark, which is why cedar I included in the spring essay or in the spring section, because they harvest the cedar bark when the sap's running, and it's a time where the trees can regrow and regenerate after the bark is peeled off of them, so it doesn't actually harm the tree. And so for summer, I have these 4 species: western bumblebee, coastal tailed frog, huckleberry, and Olympic marmot. So summer, let's see, 2021, I got to go up to Mount Ashland and go on a bumblebee hunt, because that's a fun thing to do. And I convinced my sister to join me on her vacation. And so this is taken not far from the ski area. It's at Grouse Gap, right where the PCT crosses into this area. And we were looking for 2 rare bumblebees now, the western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee, which is actually thought to be extinct. And it only lives in this small pocket of Southern Oregon. And so we spent the afternoon hunting for bumblebees. We didn't end up seeing one. They used to be the most common bumblebee in the West. They have a huge range. But over the last 20 years, their population has declined by about 90% because they have been infected with a fungal disease thought to have come from commercially raised bees that escaped and infected the native bees. So there's an image of my sister happily holding her butterfly net. And there's me navigating the brush. And I should say, I'm very terrified of bees, so this essay was more personal for me to kind of to heal our relationship that me and bees have. And I will just brag, my sister is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist. So it was really fun to have her with me for this project. So when I was writing the book, the Western bumblebee was the only species that I did not see, except when I was backpacking last year in the Eagle Cap Wilderness. And my partner was just kind of looking around these meadows of wild onions and saw this bee with a white butt. So I should say what they look like. They have yellow shoulders and a white butt, like they're just dipped in sugar. And so they're really recognizable. And yeah, pretty special to see this bee in such a remote area. And this is kind of where they've been pushed into. It's not like they only want to live in the mountains and the remote wilderness, but they have no other place to go, really. There's populations of them at Timberline and Government Camp, and then just pockets throughout the Cascades. They haven't been seen in the Coast Range for a while. And speaking of Coast Range, here's the coastal tailed frog. This essay was really fun to write and research. I got to follow an OSU graduate student around in Parker Creek on Mary's Peak, looking for these frogs. So they're a really unique old frog. They branched off from their other frog siblings 250 million years ago. So they're their own in their own separate lineage, which means that they're sister species to every frog in the world. And they're adapted to these fast moving mountain streams, cold water. So we got to see both adults and a tadpole, which was fun. As you can see, the tadpoles have these suction-like mouths that almost look like stingrays. And so that helps them, they're adapted to cling on to the rocks underneath these fast-moving streams. And so they feed on whatever's underneath the rocks. And so tailed frogs have also evolved to not need to speak or hear because they live in such loud environments. And so they communicate through other ways, like chemicals that they send to potential mates. And we saw this adult male, and tailed frogs are the only frog species in the world to have tails. The actual definition of a frog is something like amphibian without a tail. And so it's kind of funny that here they are. And it's the male's reproductive apparatus. And they have this because they live, again, in fast moving streams. So to be able to reproduce, they needed to evolve this so their hopes of their future generation didn't get washed away in the stream. So I actually used this map, and this chapter, I should say, I interviewed a Oregon Wild employee, Doug Hyken, who has worked on logging, preventing logging clear cuts in the Coast Range for at least 2 decades, I think, since the 90s. So this map was created, I believe, by an Oregon Wild volunteer, and was just really striking. So all the purple is clear cuts. And this was a map that I go back to a lot just to, kind of get a better perspective of just where things are at. And I wanted to just read a bit from the Coastal Tailed Frog essay, just briefly, describing the Coast Range. So this section is called Coast Range. I wonder what the view was like in the centuries after Calapooians took refuge on top of what's now called Mary's Peak, when the great floods burst through the valley. I imagine seeing the Pacific Ocean on a clear day to the west with the vast bunch grasses and camas fields covering the space between these mountains and the Cascades to the east. Scattered white oaks would have had enough room to grow branches so big they'd look like tiny tumbleweeds from the nearly 4,100-foot peak. What would it have been like just a few hundred years ago seeing mountain slopes of unlogged Douglas firs, some reaching heights of 400 feet, with branches weighted down by moss garlands that comforted nesting marbled murrelets. With bark thick enough, you could stick your hand into cracks that stretched across the trunk, too large to wrap your arms around, even half of its diameter. Now from the top of Mary's Peak, I see white squares of meadow foam fields, green squares of non-native grass fields, and clear cuts. Ancient forests once spanned the entire Pacific Northwest coastline, 2,000 miles from Northern California to Southeast Alaska, of trees and shrubs and streams that supported more life than we probably know. Some slopes would have been patchy from natural or native set fires, but surveys from 1933 to 1945 show that half of Oregon, Washington, and California forests were old growth, a category early surveyors based on tree size. 2/3 of Northwest forests were at least 80 years old, and just 3 to 7% of those forests are left. Oregon's Coast Range is now more like a tree farm, a checkered board of public and private land where Wall Street investors, who have probably never heard of tailed frogs, get to buy prized forests, treating them like stocks. Trees grow at the same height for acres and acres in monoculture plantations next to naked hillsides, exposing the contours of each ridge line, which should be blanketed under a canopy of green. And so this chapter, as I mentioned, tailed frogs need mountain streams, clear water, and when the hillsides are clear cut, those streams are just completely bulldozed. And I talked to a researcher who kind of compared tailed frogs to the spotted owl, in that they are kind of this like an emblem of old growth, that a creature that needs old growth to survive, and highlights how amphibians use the coastal streams, and just what we stand to lose if we keep logging the Coast Range. So the next essay is Huckleberry. And this is a view, if any of you have picked huckleberries out near Mount Adams in southwestern Washington. This is from the Sawtooth Fields, and you can see Mount Adams right here. So this essay, I discuss how long huckleberries have been in this landscape, basically since the glaciers retreated 10,000, 8,000 years ago, and the Yakima people's relationship with the berries. Similar to the prairies, this whole area was clear of conifers. You can see trees now growing in right here, and that would have historically been full of huckleberries because of the annual burns in the late summer once the rains come. And so these fields now are just a fraction of what they used to be. I also discuss in this chapter treaties, and I think it's really important, and it's pretty shameful how little most people know about treaties. It's what gives us the right to live here. And so Yakima people were promised to be able to hunt, fish, and gather forever in their usual and accustomed lands, but these lands have been mismanaged by federal agencies who banned fire, and now huckleberries are threatened. And if you ever go to the Sawtooth Fields, there's this great interpretive site here that shows some images of Yakima women and how they traditionally dried their berries. And so they laid them out on tule mats and let them smolder in the sun, but also, or let them smolder near let them dry, near a smoldering log, and also in the sun for several hours. Here's actually a remnant of one of those drying sites. I got the privilege to go out to the fields with a longtime archaeologist who worked closely with the Yakima tribe, and what seems unassuming right here is actually where the trench would have been dug. So if she would have dug into the earth, there would have been rocks where the women would have placed them to keep the tule mats in place. And so I'm just struck by these, areas on a landscape that you can be completely blind to and have no idea that, this is an archaeological site, this is an important cultural site that we, just have been blinded to because of colonialism and the ban on fires. So this is kind of going back to yellow cedar and harvesting bark. This is what the bark looks like. They're called culturally modified trees. And these ones are estimated to be, I think, from the 1700s. This is in Gifford Pinchot. And there are thousands of trees like this throughout the forest. And this is a way that the scientists have been able to get a sense of how large the huckleberry fields were, in addition to what Yakima elders told them, of course. And so women would go into the forest near the berry fields and go gather some cedar bark to make more baskets to pick more berries. The next essay is about the Olympic marmot, and this is an image from Seven Lakes Basin in the Olympics, where I saw my first Olympic marmot in this epic, rugged landscape. That's where they live. And so here is the first marmot I saw right there, perched on a rock. We had just come out from, we were just on a huckleberry meadow, lots of wildflowers, and then we come into this super rocky area, and luckily got to see this marmot, two marmots. And so Olympic marmots are endemic. They're only found in the Olympic Mountains. They've been up in the mountains since the Pleistocene, since the glaciers cut off the Olympics from the rest of the mainland. So they have evolved to live with relatively few predators since wolves didn't venture too far up into the high country. They've really only evolved to live with cougars and golden eagles. And so once the Olympic lowlands were clear cut and logged, coyotes came up and have since, and once the gray wolves were extirpated in the 30s, coyotes have been able to get up into the Olympics and have since really contributed to dramatic declines of marmot populations. It's thought that they've declined by 40 to 50% since the 1960s. And the park does annual surveys of them, volunteer marmot surveys. And so it was kind of interesting, the researcher who I talked to for the marmot, they initially thought it would be climate change that was threatening their population, but it was actually a little bit more complicated than that. So I go into the details in that chapter. Okay, so fall, again, on the Olympic Peninsula, it's one of my favorite places, probably my favorite park. This is the Hoh Rainforest. And this is like, when I was talking about the Coast Range, this is what those, ancient coastal forests would have looked like up and down the coast, which is pretty striking. The big leaf maples are almost unrecognizable in the Hoh because they're covered in so much moss. And my dream finally came true of getting to go to the Hoh Rainforest with a moss researcher. And so here they are in the field. I'll just kind of go through these slides a bit quicker because I know we're getting close to time. And so these researchers are, not much is known about moss, and in ecology, there's a process called succession, which is, who grows where and why. And so those researchers are trying to figure that out in the Hoh, and it was really fun to observe them. And the next essay in the fall is about clouds. We're all familiar with them here and hopefully have great respect for them. This is an image from downtown Portland where I spent a morning cloud watching with an artist for about 2 hours. And she had a installation at a gallery in Seattle of 6 different graphite drawings of clouds that were really lovely. And in this chapter, I talk about just the different clouds that we have. I talk about atmospheric rivers, cloud appreciation, that blue skies are boring, that clouds make everything more beautiful and more interesting, and give us all our beautiful green landscapes. And this is from High Camp, just one of the moments that I was struck by with all the different cloud layers. So this low stratus is kind of the bottom layer, we're in the middle, and then all these beautiful feathery cirrus clouds, and that's Mount Rainier. Here's an image of one of the large atmospheric rivers that came through our area. I believe this was from October or November. And it's just so striking to really imagine where these storms originated and how massive they are. And winter, I end with kind of the biggest, most charismatic species, gray whales. This is an image of Cape Lookout, which I think is the best place to see gray whales on the Oregon coast. They're actually starting to migrate maybe now. So they're gonna head up to the Arctic seas for their summer feeding grounds. And these are two whales that you, when you're at Cape Lookout, you're actually like looking above the whales, and you can see their whole form because they get really close to the Cape, because it's just, you hike out 2 miles. And so it's really a unique spot to see them. And in this essay, I talk about the Makah people's relationship to gray whales. They hunted whales for as long as anyone can remember. Here's an image of a petroglyph of a whale. This is the Ozette village, just at Cape Alava. If anyone has done the Ozette Triangle, you've come to this ancient whaling village site, which is really unique and special. And so in this chapter, I feature a Makah artist whose families were whalers. His great grandfather was the whaling chief of his ancestral village, Wyatch, which is just at the southern cusp of Cape Flattery. I should say that the Makah are at the northwesternmost point of the US, and they're actually the southernmost of the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples of Vancouver Island. And so this is Micah McCarty braiding some cedar bark on a canoe that I got to see him carve. And this is one of his masks. And here's the Wyatch River. So just beyond here is the Pacific, and then just to the right would be Cape Flattery. And this is where his family's village would have been. And kind of going back to treaties with huckleberries, I discuss the Makah's efforts to resume their whale hunts. They've been in a 20-year-long legal battle to try to resume their treaty protected right to whale. They're the only tribe in the country that has that explicit right. And it's still kind of stalled. NOAA has said that they will make a decision sometime this year. So I wanted to end the book, in winter with the, most charismatic species, with kind of a now controversial topic that, makes you really think about place and people's relationship to place, and who gets to decide how people live in their landscapes. So with that, I will end it. Sorry, I went over a little bit.
Oh, it's no problem at all. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I will share my screen again. Except that I need to. Yeah, all right. Do you see just the slide, Josephine?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you again so much for sharing your book and what you've learned and how you thought about things with us. And I'm just going to take the reins here for a few minutes to talk about Oregon Wild's work that ties in directly with a lot of what you've talked about. And for folks out there, as a reminder, if you have questions for Josephine, please enter them in the question box, and we will get to those in just a couple of minutes. So again, I'm Chandra Legui, Senior Conservation Advocate with Oregon Wild, and also author of a book about ancient forests in Oregon. Oregon Wild has been working to protect and restore wildlands, wildlife, and waters for nearly 50 years, and many of them are places and habitats that we heard about today from Josephine. So I love to get pretty nerdy about the natural world, as you know, if you have looked at my book, even though it's about hiking. And one of the things I love most about Josephine's book is that it really brings home the fact that the closer you look, the more you find. This picture of mosses and lichens and other bryophytes popped up to me in my many photos of mosses and forest floor as having just a ton of diversity. So that's one of the things you talked about, Josephine, which I thought was really great. Thinking about that biodiversity and all the niches that they fill in a forest ecosystem is mind-blowing, and how they're tied together with all the other elements of a forest and the world we inhabit. So I really got that out of your book. And I love thinking about how with clouds, we're all connected through water that is millions of years old, whether we're swimming in it or drinking it or viewing it in cloud form, in ways that enhance the landscapes that we appreciate. It's been moving around this earth for a really long time, and that's pretty powerful to think about. So I want to start with a tie-in to Alaska yellow cedar, which is also one of my favorite trees to find in the forest. Echo Basin that you talked about, and where this same tree that you showed, except with some people for scale, where this was taken is pretty unique for the size of these trees. But there are other Western Cascade forests, mostly those that haven't been logged and that are old and diverse, have these wonderful trees. Here's another example at a not too far away area called Browder Ridge that's in the headwaters of the Mackenzie River. And these are exactly the kind of forests that Oregon Wild has been working to protect and defend for decades. Today, I'm actually running this webcast from Washington, D.C., where activists from around the country are working to get the Biden administration to protect our remaining old forests through a rule that would cover all of federal public lands for the extraordinary role that they play in fighting and mitigating climate change. In this campaign, the Climate Forest Campaign has had some success already with an executive order issued by President Biden last Earth Day to work to develop policies to protect these forests. And with the cancellation of a huge timber sale in the Willamette National Forest called Flat Country, in part due to the issuance of that executive order, because it was not in keeping with it. It would have logged 2,000 acres of beautiful, mature, and old forests. The Climate Forest Campaign is one of Oregon Wild's top priorities, because in addition to the clean water, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and recreation that these forests provide, they are also our country's best large-scale natural climate solution. Unfortunately, they are also still threatened by logging, and it's time to take that option off the table. So that's what me and a bunch of other forest advocates from around the country are in DC talking about right now. And if you're not already familiar with the Climate Forest Campaign, or get emails about that, or if you haven't taken action in a petition that we have going before Earth Day, you can visit the website and do that. So one of our other big campaigns is protecting more of Oregon's waterways under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So for the past 3 years, we've been working with a coalition of partners and with Senator Wyden to develop and support the River Democracy Act, which would protect close to 4,000 miles of pristine, clean, flowing streams and rivers and the public lands that surround them. So Josephine, your story about mosses focused on the Hoh rainforests on the Olympic Peninsula, but Oregon's Coast Range is also very mossy. And one of the mossiest places that I know is the Kentucky Falls Trail and North Fork Smith River Trail on the Coast Range west of Eugene. And here's a picture of some of the moss there, as well as one of the waterfalls on that hike. And those streams, Kentucky Creek and the North Fork Smith River, would be protected as a proposed, and so they're a proposed wild and scenic river in the River Democracy Act. There's a lot of other mossy and not mossy streams included in that bill too. Here's a map from the first version of the bill that was released in a little over a year ago, showing a lot of streams all over the state that could be protected. And from the Rogue River and tributaries of the Rogue River to tributaries to the Grand Ronde and lots of headwater streams, again, covered in moss. We are, sorry, I'm gonna go back. We are hopeful that Senator Wyden will reintroduce this bill in this Congress really soon. And then we'll need your support out there to support it moving forward. All right, and finally, a lot of Josephine's book is about wildlife species found here in Oregon. And we have worked for many years to protect habitats for all kinds of wildlife, from salmon to woodpeckers to salamanders and wolves. And while many of those species that we work on are listed under the Endangered Species Act, there are a great number of sensitive species that aren't on that list that we want to ensure have healthy habitats and populations. So Oregon has a wildlife conservation action plan called the Conservation Strategy, which aims to maintain healthy fish and wildlife populations by protecting and restoring habitats and working to prevent extinction of imperiled species. The strategy species in that plan range from the coastal tailed frog. There's my picture of the one that I have seen. The greater sandhill crane, the gray whale, all from your book, and also torrent salamanders, great gray owls, bats, fishers, and a number of other species. Unfortunately, the Oregon Conservation Strategy has lacked sufficient funds to adequately protect and restore habitats, to do research, to better understand these wildlife and their needs, and more. So Oregon Wild is working to address that issue. Funding, it's really, it's hard to talk about sometimes, hard to understand, but it's really important. So we're working to pass the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA for short, which came very close to passing in Congress last year, and we hope will gain momentum again in this Congress. Most of Oregon's congressional delegation are supportive of that. And at the state level right now, Recovering Oregon's Wildlife Fund, which is HB 3159, for those of you keeping score at home, is another funding bill that would better address the needs of the Oregon Conservation Strategy. So you can find out more about that bill in particular, because as I said, it's moving in the Oregon State Legislature right now. You can find out more about that on our website and work to support that bill and this important funding. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna look at our questions. Oh, we don't have any. Or maybe you answered a few, Josephine. So if anyone has questions for Josephine, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And it looks like you answered some on that you typed. So maybe I'll pick one or two of those to start with. I think somebody asked whether marmots are preyed on by foxes or other weasel family critters.
Yeah, not that I recall. It is mostly coyotes, and I kind of zoomed through that explanation. And there is an interesting kind of climate tie to it, because coyotes do well in low snow years. So the snowpack has gradually been decreasing pretty dramatically, with some ups and downs. And the last 5 or so years, the park biologist, I think, is pretty worried about how the marmots are faring now, because the coyotes get up there earlier when there's low snow, and they can start to kind of hunt the marmots as they're waking up from their hibernation in late May or so. But yeah, they're mostly, the coyotes are what the park is worried about. And there's not any talk about removing coyotes, because that would be pretty extensive, though. When they did have to kill one coyote after it threatened a child at Hurricane Ridge, the survival rate of the marmot colony in that area went up by 60%. So that's pretty striking. But they're hoping that maybe a wolf reintroduction could help the marmots out.
Oh yeah, that's cool to think about. Yeah. Let's see. Somebody wants to know how cold it gets in Oregon. I take it you're not from Oregon, but that's cool. Thanks for listening. And yeah, I guess the answer is it depends, but I don't know, Josephine, in your travels, and researching the book and what you learned about some of the critters, maybe you have some knowledge of the cold.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will answer it in like a broader weather perspective. I think people, when they think of Oregon, think, wet, cloudy, but Oregon has like some of the most dramatic weather patterns or contrasts in weather. The east of the Cascades is, very dry compared to the west, and we're also in like a Mediterranean climate, which is interesting to think about. We have really wet winters, but then extremely dry summers. So yeah, it just depends on where you are. If you're in the high country, it's going to be very cold, and if you're in the lowlands, it might be mild, but it also might snow like 10 inches. You never know.
Yeah, we have a question about where Mount Pisgah is, that you referenced. It's as far as an area where you can find camas.
Yeah, that's just southeast of Eugene, basically Springfield. And they have a lot of great hiking trails. There's accessible trails, some that are, flat gravel that you could bring a stroller or wheelchair accessible. And then there's trails that hike up to the top of Mount Pisgah, which has this really nice view of the Willamette Valley. So yeah, if you're anywhere near the Eugene area, or even make a day trip out of it from Portland, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, it's like literally right off of I-5 in the South Eugene exit. And I can add that it's at the confluence of the Coast Fork and the Middle Fork of the Willamette Rivers, which are both pretty major tributaries, the main stem of the Willamette, which is really cool. And then, yeah, the oak savanna and prairies there are some of the last and largest remaining in the Willamette Valley, just because it has been in public ownership. It's a county park for quite some time. And there's efforts to restore that habitat through use of fire and thinning out of trees that don't belong there. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And another question about where High Camp is.
Oh yeah, High Camp. That is on the northwestern side of Mount Adams. So if you're familiar with the glaciers of Mount Adams, it's right where the Adams Glacier kind of dumps out. So you access it from Carson, and it's maybe from Portland 2 hours away. It's a really great hike, I believe 4 to 4.5 miles, and just gorgeous scenery. I've been there twice now, and one time we ate dinner and there was like a herd of 25 mountain goats nearby, and we were just watching the sunset with the goats.
Very cool. Well, for those out there, I'm not sure if everyone can see the Q&A or not, but there's lots of thanks to you, Josephine, for sharing this information and this inspiring book. Somebody did ask about where they can find the book, and I think that's a very important question.
Yeah, so you can find the book. I think I put a link in the chat to the bookshop site. It's on Goodreads, Powell's if you're in Portland, and any of the local bookstores nearby. I think might carry it, but yeah, I can go ahead and put that link in there again.
Yeah, and one last question, and I answered it in the Q&A, but just a reminder, what species of bumblebee you saw in the eagle cap? I know it's your featured one with the sugar butt. It's an easy people to remember it.
Yeah, that was, yeah, the Western bumblebee.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. Thanks for everyone for being here and tuning in. Again, stay tuned for more Oregon Wild Wednesday webcasts coming up this spring. And yeah, check out Josephine's books. Okay, yeah. There will be a follow-up email with some links and to our blog that has the recording as well as where you can find Josephine's book. So thanks again for being here and have a good night, everybody.